Miss Marple and the Scarlet Widow Mystery. Good evening and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I want to start by thanking you from the heart. Your support and presence here make this journey truly special. Preparing these mysteries is a labor of love, and it's so rewarding to see how many of you find comfort and delight in them. Our cozy community keeps growing, and that's thanks to you. If you'd like to help us share even more timeless stories, please remember to subscribe. Now let's settle in and drift together into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Widow with Red Eyes. The early spring of 1955 had been particularly kind to St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the sort of gentle warmth that encouraged daffodils to push their bright heads through the earth, and prompted elderly ladies to venture forth for their afternoon constitutionals with lighter hearts and fewer woolly scarves. It was on just such a pleasant March afternoon that Miss Jane Marple first observed the arrival of the woman who would soon set the village tongues wagging with unprecedented vigor. Miss Marple had been tending to her herbaceous border, a task that provided her with both legitimate occupation and an excellent vantage point from which to observe the comings and goings along the high street. When the taxi from Much Benham drew up outside Holly Cottage, the cottage had stood empty for the better part of 2 years, ever since old Mrs. Petherton had passed away, and the sight of a newcomer emerging from the vehicle was sufficient to cause Miss Marple to pause in her weeding and take careful note. The woman who stepped onto the pavement was striking in a way that immediately commanded attention. She was perhaps 40 years of age, though it was difficult to be certain, for she possessed that indefinable quality that some women have of seeming ageless. Her hair was the most remarkable shade of red, not the warm auburn that nature occasionally bestows, nor even the bright copper that one might see on a Celtic maiden, but a vivid scarlet that seemed to catch and hold the afternoon light like polished metal. This magnificent crown of red hair was partially concealed beneath a black felt hat of the sort favored by widows, and indeed, as Miss Marple would later learn, the newcomer was recently bereaved. Her pale face bore the unmistakable signs of recent grief, though it was her eyes that drew the most attention. They were rimmed with red, not the becoming pink that might result from fashionable cosmetics, but a raw, angry red that spoke of either prolonged weeping or some form of irritation. Dr. Haydock, who happened to be passing at that very moment, paused to tip his hat to the newcomer, and was heard to murmur something about nerves and the strain of bereavement. However, Mrs. Price Ridley, who had emerged from the post office with suspicious promptness, was of a different opinion entirely. "Mark my words," she announced to anyone within hearing distance. "That's not grief you're seeing. That's dye, pure and simple. No one has hair that color naturally. And when you go messing about with chemicals, well, it's bound to affect the eyes, isn't it?" Miss Marple, who had excellent hearing despite her advanced years, filed away both observations with the methodical precision that had served her so well in previous encounters with village mysteries. She watched as the newcomer, who introduced herself to Dr. Haydock as Mrs. Rosamond Vale, directed the taxi driver in the unloading of several modest suitcases and a trunk that had seen better days. Mrs. Vale's voice when she spoke was cultured and pleasant with just the faintest trace of what might have been a London accent. She thanked Dr. Haydock for his concern with pretty politeness, and mentioned her desire for a bit of quiet after all the troubles in town. The doctor, being a kind man, immediately launched into the sort of welcoming speech that the village reserved for potentially respectable newcomers, mentioning the various shops, the church services, and the general peacefulness of St. Mary Mead. It was during this exchange that Mrs. Vale's gaze fell upon Miss Marple, who was still ostensibly occupied with her garden border. The two women acknowledged each other with the sort of careful nod that passes between strangers in small villages, polite but reserved, each taking the measure of the other without appearing to do so. Over the following days, Mrs. Vale settled into Holly Cottage with remarkable efficiency. Mrs. Ives, a precise woman who had previously worked for the late Mrs. Petherton, was engaged as daily help and proved to be a valuable source of information for those villagers curious about their new neighbor. According to Mrs. Ives, Mrs. Vale was a widow of recent standing, having lost her husband in London under circumstances that were not entirely clear, but were certainly tragic. She'd come to St. Mary Mead seeking peace and solitude, though she received visitors with reasonable frequency. The most notable of these visitors was a gentleman who arrived twice during Mrs. Vale's first week in residence. He was sleek and well-dressed in the manner of someone who moved in fashionable circles, and he drove a motor car that drew admiring glances from the village children. Mr. Aubrey Quint, as he introduced himself to those who inquired, was a photographer with a studio in Much Benham, specializing in society portraits, and the sort of artistic studies that were currently fashionable among the wealthy. His visits to Holly Cottage were brief, but appeared to be conducted on friendly terms. Mrs. Vale received him in her parlor, and Mrs. Ives reported that tea was served, and conversation was cordial. There was nothing in these encounters to excite comment, save for the fact that any visitor to a new resident was automatically a subject of interest to the village. The second category of visitor was more problematic. Victor Vale, who claimed to be the late Mr. Vale's nephew, arrived on the Thursday of Mrs. Vale's first week in a state of considerable agitation. He was a thin, nervous young man with a harried appearance of someone perpetually between situations, as he himself put it. His interview with his uncle's widow was somewhat more extended than Mr. Quint's visits, and Mrs. Ives reported hearing raised voices from the parlor, though she was far too discreet to admit to deliberate eavesdropping. The third regular visitor was Miss Daphne Harrow, a young woman of theatrical aspirations who lived in Much Benham, and frequently graced the amateur dramatic productions of the district. She was possessed of ambition that far exceeded her talent, though she was generally acknowledged to have a flair for costume and makeup that served her well in character roles. Miss Harrow's visits to Holly Cottage were characterized by animated conversation and what Mrs. Ives described as a great deal of gesturing and carrying on. It was Miss Harrow who first used the phrase that would soon become common currency throughout the village. Upon encountering Mrs. Price Ridley outside the baker's shop, she had referred to their new neighbor as the Scarlet Widow, a designation that combined reference to Mrs. Vale's striking hair with a recent bereavement, and seemed to carry undertones that were not entirely charitable. The phrase caught on with the sort of inexorable momentum that such things possess in small communities. Within days, Mrs. Vale was known throughout St. Mary Mead as the Scarlet Widow, though the epithet was used with varying degrees of sympathy depending upon the speaker's disposition toward newcomers and their opinion of unnatural hair coloring. Miss Marple, who had observed all of these developments with her customary interest in human nature, found herself increasingly intrigued by their new neighbor. There was something about Mrs. Vale that did not quite align with the image of a grief-stricken widow seeking rural tranquility. The red-rimmed eyes, the striking hair, the curious assortment of visitors, all of these elements suggested a story more complex than the simple narrative of bereavement and retreat. It was with these thoughts occupying her mind that Miss Marple witnessed the events of the following Wednesday, when Mr. Quint arrived for his third appointment with Mrs. Vale. The photographer's motor car pulled up outside Holly Cottage at precisely 4, and he emerged carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained the proofs he had mentioned to Mrs. Ives during his previous visit. The afternoon had been pleasant, but had grown overcast as evening approached, and by 6 May a thin, steady rain had begun to fall, the sort of persistent drizzle that characterizes English springs and sends sensible people indoors to their firesides. It was perhaps 10 minutes to 6 when Mrs. Vale's scream pierced the quiet evening air, a sound of such genuine terror and distress that several neighbors, including Miss Marple, immediately abandoned their domestic occupations and hurried toward Holly Cottage. They found Mrs. Vale standing in the doorway of her parlor, one hand pressed to her throat and the other clutching the doorframe for support. Her scarlet hair had come somewhat loose from its careful arrangement, and her face was pale as paper. In the parlor beyond, sprawled before the hearth, lay the motionless form of Mr. Aubrey Quint. The brass fire screen, which normally stood guard before the fireplace, had fallen across his body, and it was immediately apparent that this substantial piece of metalwork had been the instrument of the photographer's demise. Blood pooled beneath his head, and his limbs were arranged in the awkward angles that speak of sudden and violent death. Inspector Slack, summoned hastily from Much Benham, pronounced it either a clumsy accident or the result of a lover's quarrel gone tragically wrong. The French windows that opened onto the garden were securely latched from within, and the front door had been left on the latch for the daily, as was Mrs. Vale's custom. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle beyond the obvious evidence of Mr. Quint's fatal encounter with the fire screen. The village predictably buzzed with speculation and gossip. Scarlet Widow, indeed, was the general sentiment expressed along the high street, with dark hints about the sort of woman who dyed her hair such an unnatural color and entertained gentlemen callers in her parlor. Miss Marple, who had accompanied Lady Bantry to the scene in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, found herself noting details that seemed to escape the attention of others. Mrs. Vale's red-rimmed eyes did not, in Miss Marple's experienced observation, appear to be the result of weeping. Rather, they had the irritated, inflamed appearance that might result from contact with some chemical substance. Moreover, the cottage was pervaded by a faint but distinctive combination of scents. The lemony fragrance of bergamot tea and the sharp, clean smell of eau de cologne from the direction of the bathroom. These were not the odors one would typically associate with a scene of violence and tragedy, and Miss Marple filed them away in her memory alongside her other observations. As the evening wore on and the official investigation commenced, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the death of Mr. Aubrey Quint was neither accident nor crime of passion, but something altogether more calculated and complex. The Scarlet Widow, she suspected, was not what she appeared to be, and neither perhaps was the victim himself. Chapter 2. A Body in the Parlor. Dr. Haydock's examination of the deceased was conducted with his customary thoroughness, though the results were as grimly conclusive as they were straightforward. Mr. Aubrey Quint had met his end through a single blow to the temple, delivered with considerable force by what the doctor described as the edge of a wide thing. A description that fitted the brass fire screen with uncomfortable precision. Blunt trauma, Dr. Haydock explained to Inspector Slack, who had arrived with his usual air of harried competence, and immediately set about taking charge of the scene. The blow was delivered low and flat, striking just above the ear. Death would have been instantaneous, I should think. No defensive wounds on the hands or arms, which suggests he had no warning of the attack. Inspector Slack, a man who preferred his mysteries to be straightforward affairs with obvious culprits and clear motives, examined the fire screen with the air of someone hoping it would provide immediate answers. The brass framework was substantial and heavy, ornately decorated in the Victorian manner with scrollwork and floral motifs. More significantly, its hinge showed fresh damage, a clean crack in the metal that suggested recent and violent displacement. Upon the hearthrug, barely visible against the patterned wool, lay the faint but unmistakable outline of a shoe sole. The impression was that of a woman's shoe, though the size and exact details were difficult to determine given the texture of the rug and the general disturbance of the scene. Mrs. Vale, when questioned by the inspector, maintained that Mr. Quint had stumbled somehow and that she had cried out in alarm upon seeing him fall. Her account was delivered in a voice that trembled appropriately, and her hands shook as she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her position near the parlor doorway, noted that the handkerchief showed no signs of actual dampness, and Mrs. Vale's red-rimmed eyes produced no fresh tears despite her obvious distress. The arrival of Victor Vale provided the first interruption to these proceedings. The young man appeared at Holly Cottage in a state of considerable breathlessness, having apparently run the entire distance from the Blue Boar public house upon hearing news of the tragedy. His thin face was flushed with exertion, and his sparse hair was disheveled in a manner that suggested genuine haste, rather than theatrical display. "Aunt Rosamond," he exclaimed upon seeing Mrs. Vale seated in the hall chair that Dr. Haydock had thoughtfully provided. "I came as soon as I heard. This is dreadful. Absolutely dreadful." Inspector Slack, who had developed a policeman's instinctive suspicion of relatives who appeared too quickly at scenes of violence, immediately began questioning Victor about his whereabouts during the relevant period. The young man's answers were prompt but nervous, delivered with the sort of fidgeting that suggested either guilt or a naturally anxious disposition. "I was at the Blue Boar from about 5, Victor explained, his Adam's apple working prominently as he swallowed repeatedly. "Had a pint and a bit of bread and cheese. Landlord will confirm it, I'm sure. Terrible business about poor Quint." When pressed about his relationship with the deceased photographer, Victor's manner became, if possible, even more agitated. "Saw him last week, as it happens. He had some old photographs, family things, you know. Thought Aunt Rosamond might like to have them, what with Uncle Harold passing and all." The second interruption came in the form of Miss Daphne Harrow, who arrived wearing a scarlet bolero that seemed almost aggressively bright against the somber atmosphere of the cottage. Her dramatic entrance was accompanied by exclamations of horror that struck Miss Marple as being perhaps too well rehearsed, delivered with the sort of studied emotion that spoke of amateur theatrical experience. "Oh, the poor, poor man," Miss Harrow wailed, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead in a gesture reminiscent of the heroines of melodrama. "To think that I spoke with him only yesterday. He was such a devil with wigs and powder, always fussing about the proper shades and textures for photographic work." This peculiar eulogy drew sharp glances from both Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock, though Miss Harrow seemed oblivious to the oddity of her phrasing. She continued to elaborate upon Mr. Quint's professional expertise in matters of cosmetic artifice, praising his ability to transform ordinary faces into works of photographic art through the judicious application of makeup and hairpieces. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had begun her own quiet investigation of the domestic details that others seemed inclined to overlook. While the official examination focused upon the body and the immediate scene of the crime, she turned her attention to the small inconsistencies that often proved more illuminating than dramatic evidence. In the hall, positioned upon the umbrella stand with careful precision, rested a black umbrella that bore tiny scarlet smears upon its metal ferrule. The marks were fresh and had the appearance of having been hastily wiped, though traces of the red substance remained visible to careful scrutiny. More interesting still was Miss Marple's glimpse into the bathroom, achieved through the judicious excuse of requiring a glass of water for her supposed faintness. Lady Bantry, ever solicitous of her friend's welfare, had immediately fussed about obtaining the requested refreshment, providing Miss Marple with a perfect opportunity for a moment of private observation. Upon the bathroom rail hung a towel that told its own story to eyes trained in the interpretation of domestic evidence. The linen bore a distinct tide line of orange-red coloration along one edge, the sort of staining that resulted from hair washing, particularly when the hair in question had been treated with coloring agents. The pattern of the stain suggested recent use, and the color was notably different from the vivid scarlet that had so characterized Mrs. Vale's striking coiffure. These observations, combined with her earlier notice of the cottage's distinctive scent, began to form a picture in Miss Marple's mind that differed significantly from the obvious narrative of accident or domestic violence. The lemony fragrance that permeated the air spoke of hair treatments and cosmetic preparations, while the eau de cologne suggested attempts at concealment or purification. As the evening progressed and the official investigation continued, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the death of Mr. Aubrey Quint represented something more complex than appeared on the surface. The Scarlet Widow's story, while superficially plausible, contained elements that did not quite align with the physical evidence. The positioning of the fire screen, for instance, suggested a blow delivered with both hands, rather than the sort of falling accident that Mrs. Vale described. The fresh damage to the hinge indicated deliberate force rather than accidental displacement. Most tellingly, the absence of any struggle or defensive wounds implied that Mr. Quint had been taken entirely by surprise, hardly consistent with a domestic argument or lover's quarrel. Inspector Slack, having completed his preliminary examination, announced his intention to treat the matter as either accidental death or possible manslaughter pending further investigation. His tone suggested that he considered the former more likely, given the apparent absence of clear motive or premeditation. The fire screen was obviously heavy enough to cause fatal injury if it fell with sufficient force, and accidents in domestic settings were regrettably common. Yet, as Miss Marple prepared to take her leave of Holly Cottage, accompanied by Lady Bantry and the other concerned neighbors who had gathered to offer assistance, she carried with her the certainty that Mr. Quint's death had been neither accident nor crime of passion. The Scarlet Widow's tale might satisfy Inspector Slack's preference for straightforward solutions, but it failed entirely to account for the telling details that spoke of careful preparation and deliberate deception. The red smears on the umbrella for Rule, the orange tide line on the bathroom towel, the theatrical knowledge displayed by Miss Harrow, and Victor's nervous references to old photographs, all suggested a story far more intricate than the official version would acknowledge. Someone had taken considerable trouble to arrange the scene in Holly Cottage's parlor, and Miss Marple was determined to discover both the identity of that someone and the true motive behind Mr. Aubrey Quint's untimely demise. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices. Henna. The following morning brought with it the sort of crisp clarity that often follows a night of rain, and Miss Marple found herself possessed of an unusual restlessness that prevented her from settling to her customary morning routine. The events at Holly Cottage had lodged themselves in her mind with the persistence of a half-remembered tune, and she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the curious details that had escaped the attention of Inspector Slack and his official investigation. It was while she was ostensibly occupied with deadheading the early roses that Lady Bantry appeared at her garden gate, bearing the unmistakable air of someone with news to impart. Dolly Bantry had always possessed an insatiable curiosity about the affairs of her neighbors, combined with a generous heart that prompted her to offer assistance, whether it was wanted or not. "Jane, my dear," she announced without preamble, "I've been thinking about yesterday evening, and I simply cannot put that poor woman out of my mind. Mrs. Vale, she looks so dreadfully shaken, and I can't help feeling we ought to call around and see if there's anything we can do." Miss Marple set down her secateurs and regarded her friend with the mild expression that those who knew her well had learned to interpret as keen interest disguised as gentle concern. "How very thoughtful of you, Dolly. I confess I have been somewhat worried about Mrs. Vale myself. Such a shocking experience for anyone, let alone a woman still grieving for her husband." The two ladies accordingly made their way to Holly Cottage, where they found Mrs. Vale in her sitting room, pale but composed, receiving the sort of formal condolences that small communities excel at providing. The scarlet hair that had so captured the village's imagination appeared somewhat less vivid in the morning light, though it retained its striking artificial brilliance. Mrs. Vale received her visitors with quiet gratitude, though Miss Marple detected a certain weariness beneath the widow's polite demeanor. The conversation proceeded along the predictable lines of such visits: expressions of sympathy, offers of practical assistance, and the sort of gentle inquiries about Mrs. Vale's immediate needs that propriety demanded. It was during this exchange that Miss Marple experienced one of those moments of apparent frailty that had served her so well in previous investigations. "Oh, my dear," she murmured, pressing a hand to her forehead with convincing delicacy. "I do hope you'll forgive me, but I fear I'm feeling rather faint. The shock of yesterday's events, you know. Might I trouble you for a glass of water?" Lady Bantry immediately sprang into helpful action, fussing over her friend and insisting that Mrs. Vale remain seated, while she herself fetched the requested refreshment. This charitable impulse provided Miss Marple with exactly the opportunity she had hoped for: a few moments of legitimate solitude in which to conduct a more thorough examination of the cottage's domestic arrangements. The bathroom, when reached under the pretext of requiring privacy to recover her composure, proved even more illuminating in daylight than it had the previous evening. Upon the porcelain washstand sat a bowl that bore unmistakable evidence of recent use for hair treatment. The vessel contained the dregs of what appeared to be a tea-colored rinse, accompanied by the squeezed remains of 2 lemon-eye halves and a tortoiseshell comb that had obviously been employed in the distribution of the mixture. The comb, when examined more closely, revealed brick-orange flecks caught between its teeth, the telltale residue of henna application. Miss Marple, whose knowledge of household remedies and cosmetic preparations had been acquired through decades of village life, recognized the evidence immediately. Henna, when properly prepared and applied, produced exactly the sort of orange-red tint that would require careful timing and thorough rinsing to achieve the desired effect. More significantly, she recalled her own experience with the substance during a brief flirtation with hair coloring in her younger days. Henna, once properly set and rinsed, was remarkably stable and would not run or bleed even when subjected to moisture. The preparation process, however, could be quite irritating to sensitive skin, particularly around the eyes, and the characteristic lemony scent of the treatment often lingered for hours after application. When Lady Bantry returned with the requested glass of water, Miss Marple was ready with her observations, though she chose to share them in her characteristically oblique manner. "You know, Dolly," she remarked as they made their way back to the sitting room, "henna can be quite troublesome to work with. It has such a distinctive scent, doesn't it? And it can make one's eyes terribly angry if one isn't careful about the application. Of course, once it's properly set, it doesn't run in the rain as some of the modern preparations do." Lady Bantry, whose own experience with hair coloring was limited to the occasional blue rinse administered by her London hairdresser, nodded vaguely without fully grasping the significance of these observations. Mrs. Vale, however, showed a marked reaction to Miss Marple's comments, her hand moving involuntarily to touch her throat in a gesture that spoke of sudden nervousness. Miss Marple continued her seemingly innocent discourse as they took their leave of Holly Cottage. "It's quite remarkable how different preparations behave, isn't it? Some dyes will run at the slightest dampness, while others, like henna, remain perfectly stable once set. I noticed yesterday that Mrs. Vale's scarf showed no signs of color bleeding despite that dreadful rain we had, and her veil was quite unspotted, which one wouldn't expect if her hair color had been the sort that runs. It was only when they had reached the cottage gate that Miss Marple voiced the question that had been troubling her since the previous evening. "Dolly, dear, if Mrs. Vale's hair hadn't bled color during her time outdoors in the rain, then whence came the scarlet that I observed elsewhere?" The question hung in the air between them as they walked back along the high street, each woman absorbed in her own thoughts. Lady Bantry, whose mental processes were admirably straightforward, found herself puzzled by the implications of her friend's observations. Miss Marple, however, was beginning to perceive the outlines of a deception far more elaborate than the simple tragedy it purported to be. The evidence of fresh henna treatment in Mrs. Vale's bathroom confirmed that the widow's striking red hair was indeed artificial, though achieved through methods far more permanent than the village gossip supposed. The irritation around her eyes was easily explained by the caustic nature of the preparation, rather than by grief, or more sinister chemical exposure. Most importantly, the stability of properly set henna meant that Mrs. Vale could not have been the source of any red coloring that might have appeared elsewhere during the previous evening's events. If scarlet traces had been found in other locations, and Miss Marple was increasingly certain they had, then their origin lay with someone else entirely. The implications of this realization were both profound and disturbing. If Mrs. Vale's red hair had not produced the telltale traces that Miss Marple suspected existed, then someone else with red hair had been present at Holly Cottage during the crucial period. Someone who had either departed before the discovery of Mr. Quint's body or had taken considerable trouble to conceal their presence. As they reached Miss Marple's cottage gate, she paused to regard her friend with a sort of gentle smile that those familiar with her methods had learned to interpret as the prelude to significant revelations. "I think, Dolly," she said quietly, "that we shall discover this case to be rather more complex than Inspector Slack supposes. The Scarlet Widow may indeed be the key to understanding Mr. Quint's death, but not in the manner that most people assume. Lady Bantry, conscious that her friend's seemingly innocent observations often preceded the unraveling of considerable mysteries, nodded with the sort of respectful attention that Miss Marple's insights invariably commanded, though she could not yet perceive the full significance of the morning's discoveries. She was perfectly content to wait for enlightenment, secure in the knowledge that Miss Marple's gentle probing would eventually reveal the truth behind the tragedy at Holly Cottage. Chapter 4. The Gate with the Red Streak. Miss Marple's Afternoon. Constitutional, the following day took her past Holly Cottage at precisely the time when the afternoon light fell most advantageously upon the cottage's front garden. This timing was not, of course, entirely coincidental, though Miss Marple would have been the first to acknowledge that regular exercise was essential for the maintenance of health in one's advancing years. The cottage gate, which she had observed only in passing during the previous day's tragic events, now presented itself as an object worthy of more detailed examination. It was a typical garden gate of the sort found throughout English villages, painted white, though the paint showed the sort of weathering that spoke of several seasons' exposure to wind and rain. What caught Miss Marple's particular attention, however, was a streak of vivid color upon the gate's top rail. The mark was positioned on the side that faced away from the cottage, as though someone departing the premises might have grasped the rail for support or balance. In the clear afternoon light, the stain appeared to be a bright crimson, quite different from the orange-red hue that characterized Mrs. Vale's henna-treated hair. Miss Marple approached the gate with the sort of casual interest that might be expected from any curious neighbor, though her examination was considerably more systematic than appearances suggested. From her reticule she extracted a small handkerchief, folded into a neat square, and applied it gently to the suspicious stain. The result was both immediate and illuminating. The crimson color lifted readily onto the white linen, leaving a vivid smear that spoke of recent application and fugitive dye. This was not the stable coloring of properly set henna, but rather the sort of temporary tint that would run at the slightest touch of moisture, precisely the kind of artificial coloring that might be employed in theatrical applications. Moreover, the stain appeared only on the rain side of the gate rail, suggesting that it had been deposited during the previous evening's shower. Someone with wet, artificially colored hair had grasped this rail, leaving behind unmistakable evidence of their passage. A closer examination of the gravel path just inside the gate revealed additional confirmation of Miss Marple's growing suspicions. Among the ordinary stones and earth lay several short, bright red hairs that gleamed like tiny jewels in the afternoon sun. These specimens were quite different in both color and texture from any natural hair Miss Marple had encountered. They possessed the artificial brilliance and slightly coarse texture that characterized the synthetic materials used in theatrical wigs. "Stage red," Miss Marple murmured to herself, collecting several of the telltale strands with careful precision. The evidence was mounting toward a conclusion that diverged significantly from the official interpretation of the previous evening's events. It was at this moment that young Timothy Ransom, known throughout the village as Tibby, emerged from behind the hedge, where he had been pursuing some boyish enterprise involving the collection of interesting stones. Tibby was perhaps 10 years of age, possessed of the sort of sharp observational skills that children often display when adults assume they're paying no attention whatsoever. "Hello, Miss Marple," he said with the cheerful directness of childhood. "Are you looking for clues about the murder?" Miss Marple smiled at the boy's frank curiosity. Children, in her experience, often possessed information that proved invaluable to the resolution of mysterious circumstances, though extracting such information required a delicate touch and an appreciation for the juvenile mind's particular logic. "I'm merely taking my usual walk, Tibby," she replied gently, "though I confess I'm rather curious about yesterday evening's sad events." "Were you about the village, then?" The boy's face brightened with the importance of possessing relevant information. "Oh, yes, miss. I was down by the church wall looking for a cricket ball that went over during our game. That's when I saw the red-headed lady running out of Mrs. Vale's gate." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken, though she maintained her expression of mild interest. "A red-headed lady, you say? Mrs. Vale herself, perhaps?" Tibby shook his head with the sort of certainty that children display when correcting adult assumptions. "Oh, no, miss. This lady was different. She was running ever so fast, and she was carrying a bag. And she didn't have nothing on her head, no hat or anything. Just all red curls flying about in the rain." The boy's testimony provided crucial confirmation of Miss Marple's developing theory. Someone other than Mrs. Vale had been present at Hawley Cottage during the relevant period. Someone with conspicuously red hair who had departed in considerable haste, leaving behind physical evidence of their passage. "And when did you observe this lady, Tibby?" Miss Marple inquired with studied casualness. "Just before the screaming started," the boy replied promptly. "I heard Mrs. Vale cry out something terrible just after the red lady ran past me toward the high street. Made me drop my cricket ball again, it did." This chronology was particularly significant, as it suggested that the mysterious red-headed woman had departed Hawley Cottage immediately before the discovery of Mr. Quint's body. The timing was far too convenient to be coincidental, and the evidence of hasty flight spoke of guilt rather than innocent departure. Miss Marple thanked young Tibby for his information and continued her walk, though her mind was now occupied with the task of reconciling this new intelligence with her previous observations. The picture that emerged was one of careful deception and calculated misdirection, executed by someone with access to theatrical props and sufficient knowledge of cosmetic artifice to carry off an elaborate masquerade. The red stain on the gate, combined with Tibby's eyewitness account, confirmed that someone wearing an artificial red wig had been present at Hawley Cottage during the crucial period. The hasty departure, the evidence of running dye, and the absence of any head covering all suggested panic and poor planning, or perhaps the sort of genuine fear that might accompany the commission of a violent crime. As she made her way back toward her own cottage, Miss Marple found herself considering the implications of these discoveries. Mrs. Vale, with her carefully maintained henna coloring and her story of accidental death, appeared increasingly to be either an innocent victim of circumstance or a willing participant in the elaborate deception. The true perpetrator, however, seemed to be someone with theatrical skills and access to stage properties, someone who had assumed the identity of a red-headed woman for reasons that were not yet clear. The evidence was accumulating with gratifying speed, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly incomplete. Miss Marple was certain that the solution to Mr. Quint's death lay in understanding the relationship between the various red-headed women who figured in the case. The genuine Mrs. Vale with her henna-treated hair, and the mysterious figure with the fugitive dye who had fled Holly Cottage in such obvious haste. The theatrical elements of the crime suggested someone with experience in the dramatic arts, while the timing and execution implied intimate knowledge of Mrs. Vale's domestic arrangements. Most significantly, the elaborate nature of the deception indicated that the murder had been planned well in advance, despite the apparent spontaneity of the violent encounter in the parlor. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself more convinced than ever that the death of Mr. Aubrey Quint represented something far more complex than the simple domestic tragedy that Inspector Slack was prepared to accept. The Scarlet Widow might indeed hold the key to the mystery, but not in the manner that anyone yet suspected. Chapter 5. Wig Fibers by the Hearth. The opportunity to conduct a more thorough examination of Holly Cottage's parlor presented itself the following morning when Mrs. Vale, overwhelmed by the continued attention of well-meaning neighbors, accepted Lady Bantry's invitation to spend the day at Gossington Hall. This charitable arrangement had been proposed ostensibly for Mrs. Vale's benefit, though Miss Marple suspected that her friend's motives included a healthy measure of curiosity about their mysterious neighbor. Miss Marple's own involvement in this domestic reorganization came about through her offer to supervise the cottage while Mrs. Vale was absent, ensuring that any official visitors would be properly received and that the premises remained secure. Inspector Slack had indicated his intention to conduct a final examination of the scene, though he had made it clear that he considered the matter essentially resolved. Left alone in the cottage's parlor, Miss Marple found herself free to pursue the sort of detailed investigation that had been impossible during the confusion of the previous evening. The room bore the unmistakable atmosphere of recent tragedy, though the physical evidence of violence had been largely cleared away. The fire screen had been restored to its proper position, though the damaged hinge remained as testimony to the force with which it had been employed. Miss Marple's attention was immediately drawn to the hearth itself, where the interplay of light and shadow revealed details that might easily escape casual observation. The brick surround, when examined with the methodical precision that characterized her approach to such matters, yielded 2 tiny fibers that clung to the rough surface near the base. These specimens were remarkable for their vivid coloration, a shade of red so intense that it resembled the crimson curtains of a toy theater, rather than any natural hair color. When Miss Marple carefully extracted the fibers and held them to the window light, their artificial nature became immediately apparent. They possessed the slightly harsh texture and unnatural uniformity that distinguish synthetic materials from their natural counterparts. More revealing still was their behavior when subjected to the flame of a match. Natural hair, when burned, produces a characteristic smell and burns with a steady flame before crumbling to ash. These fibers, however, shrank and melted upon contact with heat, forming tiny beads of hardened material that spoke unmistakably of their synthetic origin. The coal scuttle, positioned beside the hearth in its traditional location, provided additional evidence of theatrical artifice. Nestled among the lumps of coal was a small metal object that proved upon closer examination to be a wig pin of the sort employed in the professional theater to secure artificial hairpieces. The pin showed signs of recent use with tiny fibers of the same vivid red color caught in its clasp. Mechanism. Miss Marple's exploration of the area beneath the sofa yielded perhaps the most significant discovery of all. Hidden in the shadows, where it might easily be overlooked, was a small dab of brown adhesive material that emitted a faintly resinous scent when warmed between her fingers. She recognized it immediately as spirit gum, the specialized adhesive employed by actors to secure false hairpieces, beards, and other theatrical prosthetics. The presence of spirit gum in Mrs. Vale's parlor was particularly damning, as it suggested not merely the wearing of a wig, but the sort of professional application that indicated considerable experience with theatrical techniques. This was not the casual donning of a hairpiece, but rather the careful construction of a complete disguise. When Miss Marple turned her attention to the fire screen itself, she discovered evidence that supported her growing conviction that Mr. Quint's death had been carefully staged rather than the result of accident or spontaneous violence. The brass framework, when examined in proper light, showed a fresh crescent of polish along its top edge, where it had obviously been grasped by gloved or careful hands. More significantly, the screen bore traces of colored powder that had nothing to do with coal dust or fireplace ash. The substance, when rubbed between her fingers, proved to be rouge of the sort employed in theatrical makeup, the kind of heavy pigmented preparation designed to be visible under stage lighting and to withstand the rigors of performance. The positioning and angle of these traces suggested that the fire screen had been lifted and swung deliberately, rather than falling accidentally as Mrs. Vale's account suggested. The evidence pointed to a calculated blow, delivered with both hands and sufficient force to ensure a fatal result. Miss Marple's reconstruction of the crime began to take shape as she studied the physical evidence in conjunction with her previous observations. Someone skilled in theatrical arts had entered Holly Cottage wearing an elaborate disguise that included a synthetic red wig secured with professional-grade spirit gum. This individual had encountered Mr. Quint in the parlor, and during the course of their interaction had struck him down using the fire screen as a weapon. The killer had then attempted to stage the scene to suggest accidental death, though their hasty departure had left behind numerous traces of their artificial hair and theatrical preparations. The running dye that had stained the gate, the fibers that had caught on the hearth bricks, and the professional adhesives that had secured their disguise, all testified to the elaborate nature of the deception. What remained unclear was the identity of this theatrical murderer and their motive for eliminating Mr. Aubrey Quint. The photographer's profession suggested several possibilities. He might have possessed compromising images, engaged in blackmail, or simply witnessed something that made him dangerous to the killer's plans. The theatrical nature of the crime pointed towards someone with stage experience, while the intimate knowledge of Holly Cottage's layout suggested either careful surveillance or previous familiarity with the premises. Most intriguingly, the deliberate choice to disguise oneself as a red-headed woman implied a desire to cast suspicion upon Mrs. Vale herself. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Holly Cottage, she found herself increasingly certain that she was dealing with a premeditated murder, disguised as domestic accident. The killer had possessed both the skills and the materials necessary to carry out an elaborate deception, though their execution had been imperfect enough to leave behind a trail of evidence that would ultimately lead to their exposure. The synthetic fibers, the spirit gum, the wig pin, and the theatrical rouge all painted a picture of someone thoroughly familiar with the arts of disguise and performance. When combined with Tibby Ransom's eyewitness account of the fleeing red-headed woman, these discoveries provided a foundation upon which the complete solution to the mystery might be constructed. Inspector Slack's straightforward interpretation of the case as accidental death or domestic violence now appeared woefully inadequate in the face of such complex evidence. The truth behind Mr. Quint's demise lay not in the simple explanations that satisfied conventional investigation, but in the realm of theatrical artifice and elaborate deception that Miss Marple was uniquely qualified to navigate. Chapter 6. 2 alibis. One hand, Miss Marple's investigation into the alibis of the various parties connected with Mr. Quint's death began with what appeared to be a perfectly innocent visit to Mrs. Crisp's tea rooms in Much Benham. The establishment, which served both as a respectable dining venue and an informal center for local intelligence, proved to be ideally situated for the sort of discreet inquiries that the circumstances required. Mrs. Crisp herself was a woman of the middle years whose observational skills rivaled those of any professional investigator, though her motives were purely commercial rather than scientific. The success of her establishment depended largely upon her ability to remember her customers' preferences and habits, a talent that extended naturally to the recording of unusual or noteworthy behavior. Miss Marple's ostensible purpose in visiting the tea rooms was to return a small cloakroom ticket that Lady Bantry had discovered in her coat pocket following their previous day's expedition. This innocent errand provided the perfect opportunity to engage Mrs. Crisp in conversation about the events of Wednesday evening and the movements of various individuals during the relevant period. Such a dreadful business. About poor Mr. Quint, Miss Marple observed, as she placed the numbered ticket upon the counter. I understand that several people from our area were in Much Benham that evening. Mrs. Crisp, who had been following the developments at Holly Cottage with the sort of keen interest that such dramatic events inevitably generated, was more than willing to discuss her observations. Indeed, Miss Marple, we had quite a busy evening, what with the Amateur Dramatic Society holding their rehearsal at the church hall and various other people coming and going. The cloakroom ticket that Lady Bantry had inadvertently retained bore a timestamp of 4:58, a detail that Miss Marple had noted with particular interest. When Mrs. Crisp produced the corresponding receipt book, the entry showed a distinctive signature that caught Miss Marple's practiced eye immediately. The name D. Bantry was written in Lady Bantry's characteristic sprawling hand, with the sort of fluid loops and flourishes that made her writing instantly recognizable. More significantly, the final letter Y displayed the particular curled formation that Dolly employed when signing her name with her favorite fountain pen. I wonder, Miss Marple mused with studied casualness, whether Miss Daphne Harrow was among your customers that evening. She mentioned to me that she had been rehearsing with the Dramatic Society. Mrs. Crisp consulted her records with the sort of methodical precision that characterized all her business dealings. Indeed she was, Miss Marple. Miss Harrow signed our visitor's book at 4:55, just before the rehearsal was due to begin. Such a dedicated young lady, always punctual for her theatrical commitments. The timing was significant, as it placed Miss Harrow in Much Benham at virtually the same moment that Lady Bantry's cloakroom ticket was being processed. Miss Marple examined the visitor's book with the sort of polite interest that her inquiry warranted, noting immediately that the signature attributed to D. Harrow displayed handwriting characteristics that bore a remarkable resemblance to Lady Bantry's distinctive style. The final letter W in Harrow exhibited precisely the same fluid loop that characterized the Y in Bantry, executed with what appeared to be identical pen pressure and angle. The resemblance was so striking that Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the same hand had produced both signatures within the space of 3 minutes. This discovery prompted a more detailed investigation into Miss Harrow's claimed whereabouts during the evening in question. The Amateur Dramatic Society's rehearsal register, which Mrs. Crisp was able to produce through her connections with the church hall's caretaker, showed D. Harrow as having arrived at 4:55 and remained until the conclusion of the session at 7 Wa. However, when Miss Marple compared this entry with the signature in the tea room's visitor's book, the handwriting appeared virtually identical. Not merely similar, as might be expected from the same person signing different documents, but identical in a manner that suggested both entries had been made at the same time by the same individual. The implications were disturbing. If Miss Harrow had indeed signed both the tea room's cloakroom book and the Dramatic Society's attendance register in rapid succession, She could theoretically have established her presence in Much Benham while actually being elsewhere during the crucial period when Mr. Quint met his death. Miss Marple's investigation into Victor. Vale's alibi proved equally revealing, though in a different manner. The young man had claimed to have been at the Blue Boar public house from 5 until well after 6 yow, and the landlord's testimony appeared to support this account. However, when Miss Marple made discreet inquiries among other residents of St. Mary Mead, a more complex picture emerged. Mrs. Nora Pike, whose cottage commanded an excellent view of the village's main thoroughfare, reported having observed Victor at the pillar box near the post office at 20 minutes to 6. He had been posting what appeared to be a substantial envelope addressed, so far as she could determine, to someone in Reading. This sighting placed Victor considerably closer to Holly Cottage during the relevant period than his stated alibi would suggest. Moreover, the timing of his appearance at the, pillar box coincided almost exactly with the period when Mr. Quint would have been arriving at Mrs. Vale's cottage for his fatal appointment. The envelope that Victor had posted added another layer of complexity to the situation. If he had indeed been conducting urgent correspondence at the very moment when a murder was being committed nearby, the timing seemed too convenient to be entirely coincidental. The addressing of the letter to Reading suggested communication with parties outside the immediate vicinity, perhaps creditors, employers, or other individuals connected with Victor's perpetually precarious financial situation. When Miss Marple considered these various pieces of evidence in conjunction with her previous discoveries, a pattern began to emerge that cast doubt upon the alibis of both potential suspects. Miss Harrow's apparent ability to be in two places simultaneously suggested either supernatural powers or a deliberate attempt to create false documentation of her whereabouts. Victor's presence near the scene of the crime, combined with his nervous behavior and urgent correspondence, indicated involvement in events more significant than his casual admission of financial difficulties would suggest. The envelope to Reading might represent anything from a confession of guilt to an attempt to establish a false trail for investigators to follow. Most significantly, both individuals appeared to possess motives that extended beyond the simple financial embarrassment that had initially seemed to characterize their relationships with the deceased photographer. Miss Harrow's theatrical background provided her with both the skills and the materials necessary to carry out the elaborate deception that the physical evidence suggested, while Victor's obvious desperation hinted at pressures that might drive even a normally law-abiding person to extreme measures. The handwriting evidence in particular pointed toward Miss Harrow as the more likely perpetrator of the complex fraud that the alibis represented. Her ability to manipulate signatures and create false documentation suggested experience with deception that went beyond the normal requirements of amateur theatrical performance. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Mrs. Crisp's establishment, she found herself increasingly convinced that the solution to Mr. Quint's murder lay in understanding the true nature of the relationships between the photographer and his various clients. The elaborate nature of the alibis suggested that at least one of the participants had planned the crime well in advance, taking considerable care to establish apparent innocence through fraudulent documentation. The question that remained was whether the killer had acted alone or in concert with others who might benefit from Mr. Quint's death. The evidence pointed toward a conspiracy of considerable sophistication, executed by individuals with both the skills and the motivation necessary to carry out such an elaborate deception. Chapter 7. Spirit Gum in a Vanity Case. Miss Marple's return visit to Mrs. Crisp's tea rooms the following afternoon was prompted by what appeared to be a minor domestic crisis involving Lady Bantry's missing gloves. This ostensible emergency provided the perfect excuse for another conversation with the proprietress, whose encyclopedic knowledge of her establishment's lost property often proved invaluable to absent-minded customers. "I do hope you might be able to help. Mrs. Crisp," Miss Marple began with the sort of apologetic flutter that had served her well in previous investigations. Lady Bantry is quite beside herself about her gloves, the gray kid ones with the pearl buttons. She's convinced she must have left them here during our visit yesterday. Mrs. Crisp, whose business sense was matched only by her genuine desire to assist her clientele, immediately began a systematic search of the establishment's various storage areas. The tea rooms maintained a small cloakroom facility for the convenience of their more genteel customers, and it was here that the most interesting discoveries were typically made. "I'm afraid I don't see Lady Bantry's gloves," Mrs. Crisp announced after a thorough examination of the shelves and hooks. "Though there is this little vanity case that's been sitting unclaimed since Wednesday evening. Perhaps the lady who left it will return for it soon." The vanity case in question was a modest affair of black leather, showing signs of regular use, though not of particular quality. It bore no external identification that might indicate its owner, though its presence in the cloakroom suggested it had been deposited by someone who had intended to return for it shortly. Miss Marple examined the case with the sort of polite curiosity that might be expected from any concerned citizen, hoping to assist in reuniting lost property with its rightful owner. How peculiar that someone should simply abandon such a personal item. Perhaps if we were to examine its contents, we might find some indication of the owner's identity. Mrs. Crisp, whose natural discretion warred briefly with her commercial instincts, eventually concluded that customer service required some degree of investigation. "I suppose it would do no harm to take a quick look, particularly if it might help us return the case to its proper owner." The contents of the vanity case proved to be both illuminating and disturbing. Among the usual feminine accessories, a compact mirror, a lipstick, and several hairpins, were items that spoke of more specialized applications. A small bottle of spirit gum, identical to the adhesive traces that Miss Marple had discovered beneath Mrs. Vale's sofa, occupied a place of prominence within the case's silk-lined interior. More significant still was a folded length of material that proved upon examination to be a cheap wig net of the sort employed in amateur theatrical productions. The net was dyed a vivid crimson that matched exactly the artificial fibers Miss Marple had found upon Holly Cottage's hearth, and it showed signs of recent use in the form of stretched mesh and tangled threads. The most damning evidence, however, was a stage wig cap that had been hastily stuffed into the case's corner compartment. The cap bore a significant tear near the nape, as though it had been removed in considerable haste, and its interior showed traces of the same spirit gum that had been found at the scene of the crime. Mrs. Crisp, whose knowledge of her customers' habits was remarkably comprehensive, was able to provide additional details about the case's deposition. The lady who checked this was quite striking. All red curls and no hat, as I recall. She paid for a cloakroom ticket at 4 to 5 and seemed in something of a hurry. This timing coincided precisely with a period when Miss Harrow had supposedly signed the visitor's book, though Mrs. Crisp's description of the customer's appearance suggested someone in a state of considerable agitation rather than the composed actress preparing for an evening's rehearsal. She dashed out again at 5. Mrs. Crisp continued, wearing a black hat that she hadn't had when she arrived. "I remember thinking it odd that someone would change their headwear in the cloakroom, but one sees all sorts of peculiar behavior in this business. The pattern of arrival and departure that," Mrs. Crisp described, painted a vivid picture of someone using the tea room's cloakroom as a staging area for a complex transformation. The timing allowed for a rapid journey to Holly Cottage, the commission of murder, and a hasty return to Much Benham in time to establish an alibi at the Dramatic Society's rehearsal. Miss Marple's examination of the spirit gum bottle revealed one final piece of crucial evidence. The glass surface bore a clear thumbprint, partially obscured by a smear of theatrical rouge that matched the cosmetic traces found on Holly Cottage's fire screen. The print was positioned in such a manner as to suggest it had been made by someone applying the adhesive with considerable care, though the accompanying rouge smear indicated that the user had been wearing stage makeup during the application. The accumulation of evidence within the abandoned vanity case created an almost complete inventory of the materials necessary to construct the elaborate disguise that the physical evidence suggested. The spirit gum would secure a wig, the net would provide additional anchoring for artificial hair, and the damaged cap showed signs of hasty removal after the disguise had served its purpose. When Miss Marple considered this discovery in conjunction with her previous observations, the outlines of the crime began to assume definitive shape. Someone with access to theatrical supplies and considerable skill in their application had used Mrs. Crisp's cloakroom as a changing room, transforming themselves into a red-headed woman before proceeding to Holly Cottage for the fatal encounter with Mr. Quint. The hasty departure from the cottage documented by young Tibby Ransom's eyewitness account had been followed by an equally rapid return to the cloakroom, where the disguise had been hastily dismantled and abandoned. The black hat that Mrs. Crisp had observed represented the final element of the transformation, allowing the killer to resume their normal appearance and proceed to establish an alibi elsewhere. The professional quality of the materials and their sophisticated application pointed towards someone with considerable experience in theatrical arts. The timing of the transformation and the precision of the alibi construction suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of both the victim's schedule and the geography of the local area. Most significantly, the abandonment of such incriminating evidence in a public cloakroom indicated either supreme confidence in the killer's ability to avoid detection or a degree of panic that had interfered with more careful disposal of the evidence, as Miss Marple prepared to leave Mrs. Crisp's establishment, having naturally failed to locate Lady Bantry's fictional gloves. She found herself in possession of evidence that conclusively linked the theatrical elements of the crime to a specific individual with both the skills and the opportunity to carry out such an elaborate deception. The vanity case and its contents represented the final pieces of a complex puzzle that had begun with the discovery of Mr. Quint's body and would soon reach its inevitable conclusion with the exposure of his killer. The spirit gum, the wig net, and the damaged cap all testified to the premeditated nature of the crime and the theatrical expertise of its perpetrator. Chapter 8. Letters in the Photographer's Drawer, Inspector. Slack's investigation into Mr. Aubrey Quint's business affairs had proceeded with the sort of methodical thoroughness that characterized his approach to official duties, though his discoveries proved far more illuminating than his initial assessment of the case had suggested. The photographer's studio in Much Benham, when subjected to proper scrutiny, revealed aspects of his professional activities that cast an entirely different light upon the circumstances surrounding his death. Miss Marple became aware of these developments through Dr. Haydock, who had encountered the inspector at the George and Dragon during what appeared to be a moment of considerable frustration with the complexities that his investigation had uncovered. The good doctor, whose discretion in professional matters was matched only by his genuine concern for the welfare of his patients and neighbors, felt justified in sharing information that might prove relevant to the safety of the community. Slacks discovered some rather unsavory aspects to Quint's business. Dr. Haydock confided to Miss Marple during one of his routine visits to check upon her health. It seems the man was engaged in activities that went well beyond legitimate portrait photography. There's evidence of systematic blackmail conducted over a considerable period. The details that Dr. Haydock was able to provide based upon his conversation with the inspector painted a picture of Mr. Quint as a man who had used his professional access to fashionable society as a means of gathering compromising information about his clients. The photographer's studio had served as the setting for indiscretions that were subsequently documented and used as leverage for financial gain. Among the most significant discoveries in Quint's private correspondence was a series of letters that revealed the extent of his extortionate activities. These documents, which had been hastily burned but not completely destroyed, provided insight into the relationships between the photographer and several individuals who might have had compelling reasons to desire his permanent silence. The first letter, addressed to RV and partially reconstructed from the charred remains found in Quint's fireplace, appeared to be a receipt acknowledging payment of $30 in exchange for the return of 3 negatives of a compromising nature. The document was dated the previous month, suggesting that Mrs. Rosamond Vale had recently concluded some form of financial arrangement with the deceased. This correspondence cast Mrs. Vale's relationship with Quint in an entirely different light than her public statements had suggested. Rather than the simple professional arrangement she had described, their connection appeared to have involved the sort of delicate negotiation that typically accompanied blackmail situations. The second letter, directed to D.H. and bearing clear evidence of deliberate destruction, was more extensive in its demands. The fragmentary text that Inspector Slack had been able to recover included references to a sum of $100 and specific mention of performance dates and theatrical engagements. The tone of the correspondence was unmistakably threatening, though couched in the sort of euphemistic language that blackmailers typically employed to maintain a veneer of respectability. This document provided crucial insight into Miss Daphne Harrow's relationship with the photographer and suggested motives that extended far beyond the professional interactions she had publicly acknowledged. The reference to performance dates indicated that Quint possessed information that could potentially damage Miss Harrow's theatrical aspirations, while the substantial financial demand represented a burden that someone of her modest means would find difficult to sustain. The third letter proved to be the most revealing of all, though its torn condition required considerable effort to reconstruct. Addressed to Victor Vale, the correspondence painted a picture of a young man in desperate financial straits, pleading for additional time to meet obligations that had apparently been accumulating over an extended period. The fragmentary text included phrases such as, "absolutely cannot raise the full amount at present and beg your indulgence for another fortnight," combined with references to the old indiscretion and youthful folly that should remain buried. These passages suggested that Victor's relationship with Quint involved compromising information from his past rather than recent financial difficulties. When Miss Marple considered these revelations in conjunction with her previous discoveries, the motives for Mr. Quint's murder became substantially clearer. Each of the 3 primary suspects had been subjected to financial pressure based upon information that the photographer had gathered through his professional activities, creating compelling reasons for wanting to eliminate their tormentor permanently. Mrs. Vale's recent payment of $30 suggested that she had already capitulated to Quint's demands, though the ongoing nature of blackmail schemes meant that this settlement might have represented merely the first installment of a continuing financial drain. Her cooperation with the photographer's demands indicated both vulnerability and the resources to meet his price. At least initially, Miss Harrow's situation appeared more precarious, as the demand for $100 represented a sum that would be difficult for someone of her circumstances to obtain. The reference to theatrical performances suggested that Quint possessed evidence that could damage her professional reputation, making compliance with his demands essential to her continued career prospects. Victor's correspondence revealed perhaps the most desperate situation of all. His inability to meet Quint's financial demands, combined with references to past indiscretions, suggested a young man trapped in an increasingly impossible situation. The pleading tone of his letter indicated that he had exhausted conventional means of obtaining the necessary funds and might be driven to extreme measures. The systematic nature of Quint's blackmail operation suggested a man who had made numerous enemies over the course of his career. The careful documentation of his victims' compromising situations, combined with the methodical escalation of his financial demands, painted a picture of someone who had grown overconfident in his ability to manipulate others through their secrets. However, the specific timing of his death, combined with the elaborate theatrical deception that had been employed to conceal the killer's identity, indicated that this particular murder had been planned with considerable care rather than committed in a moment of desperate impulse. The evidence from the letters supported Miss Marple's growing conviction that Miss Harrow represented the most likely perpetrator of the crime. Her theatrical background provided both the skills necessary to execute the elaborate disguise and the knowledge required to stage the scene convincingly. Moreover, her financial situation made compliance with Quint's demands particularly difficult, while her professional reputation made exposure of his information particularly damaging. The $100 demand represented a sum that would have been beyond Miss Harrow's immediate means, forcing her to seek alternative solutions to her predicament. The theatrical elements of the murder suggested someone who had chosen to employ her professional skills rather than conventional means to resolve her difficulties. As Miss Marple reflected upon these developments, she found herself increasingly certain that the solution to the mystery lay not in the simple explanations that Inspector Slack preferred, but in the complex web of relationships and obligations that Mr. Quint had woven around his various victims. The photographer's death represented not a crime of passion or accident, but a carefully calculated elimination of a threat that had grown too dangerous to endure out. Chapter 9, The Red That Wouldn't Run, the pieces of the puzzle that had occupied Miss Marple's thoughts for the better part of a week finally began to assume their proper arrangement during a quiet afternoon in Lady Bantry's morning room at Gossington Hall. The two ladies had ostensibly gathered for their customary discussion of parish affairs, though the conversation inevitably turned to the tragic events that had so disrupted the tranquility of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had brought with her a selection of items that might have appeared innocuous to the casual observer, but which represented the accumulated evidence of her methodical investigation. These specimens were arranged with careful precision upon Dolly's mahogany side table, creating a small exhibition that would have done credit to a forensic laboratory. "I think, my dear Dolly," Miss Marple began, with the sort of gentle authority that her friends had learned to respect, "that the time has come to examine the various types of red coloring that have figured so prominently in this unfortunate affair. Each specimen tells its own story, and together they reveal the truth behind Mr. Quint's death." The first sample consisted of several strands of hair that Miss Marple had obtained during her visit to Holly Cottage's bathroom. These specimens displayed the characteristic brick-orange hue that resulted from properly applied henna treatment, combined with a coarse texture that distinguished natural hair that had been chemically processed. "This represents Mrs. Vale's actual hair color," Miss Marple explained, holding the strands to the window light. "Henna, when correctly prepared and thoroughly rinsed, produces this warm orange-red shade. More importantly, it creates a permanent bond with the hair shaft that will not run or fade when exposed to moisture." To demonstrate this principle, Miss Marple dampened her handkerchief and pressed it against the henna-treated hair. The linen remained completely unsoiled, confirming the stability of the coloring agent, even under conditions that would cause other preparations to bleed profusely. The second sample was quite different in both appearance and behavior. This consisted of the vivid scarlet streak that Miss Marple had lifted from Holly Cottage's gate, preserved on the handkerchief where she had originally collected it. The color was far more intense than the henna specimens, possessing the artificial brilliance that characterizes synthetic dyes. When Miss Marple touched this sample with a moistened finger, the results were immediately dramatic. The scarlet color transferred readily to her skin, leaving a vivid stain that spoke of fugitive dye and temporary application. "This represents the coloring from a cheap theatrical wig," she explained to Lady Bantry, who was following these demonstrations with rapt attention. Such preparations are designed for short-term use and will run at the slightest contact with moisture. The rain on Wednesday evening would have caused exactly this sort of bleeding, leaving traces wherever the wearer came into contact with surfaces. The third category of evidence consisted of the synthetic fibers that Miss Marple had recovered from Holly Cottage's hearth. These specimens were remarkable for their uniform texture and the intensity of their coloration, which surpassed even the most vivid natural red hair. Miss Marple's demonstration of these fibers' properties was perhaps the most revealing of all. When touched with the flame of a match, the specimens immediately began to shrink and melt, forming tiny beads of hardened material that bore no resemblance to the ash that natural hair would produce. These are artificial fibers of the sort used in inexpensive stage wigs, she observed, as the melted remnants cooled upon the table surface. Their behavior when heated confirms their synthetic origin, and explains why they were found scattered about the hearth where the fire screen fell. Lady Bantry, whose understanding of the case had been gradually expanding through Miss Marple's methodical exposition, began to grasp the implications of these various discoveries. "You're suggesting that there were actually two different red-headed women involved in Wednesday evening's events?" Miss Marple nodded approvingly at her friend's deduction. "Precisely, my dear. Mrs. Vale, with her genuine henna treatment, represents one type of red coloring entirely. The mysterious figure that young Tibby observed fleeing the scene represents quite another. The child saw exactly what he reported. A woman with unnaturally bright red hair running without a hat through the rain, leaving behind the sort of dye traces that only cheap artificial coloring would produce. The significance of this distinction extended far beyond mere matters of cosmetic chemistry. If Mrs. Vale's stable henna coloring could not have produced the running scarlet traces found on the gate, then someone else had been present at Holly Cottage during the crucial period. Someone wearing an artificial red wig that had betrayed its synthetic nature through contact with the evening's rain. Miss Marple's reconstruction of the crime began to assume definitive form as she explained her conclusions to Lady Bantry. The killer had arrived at Holly Cottage wearing an elaborate disguise that included a cheap theatrical wig, spirit gum for secure attachment, and the sort of stage makeup that would enhance the artificial appearance. "The murderer's plan was quite clever in its conception," Miss Marple observed, gathering her various specimens with careful precision. "By disguising themselves as a red-headed woman, they hoped to cast suspicion upon Mrs. Vale herself. The scarlet hair would be remembered by any witnesses, while the genuine Scarlet Widow would appear to be the obvious culprit. However, the execution of this plan had been flawed in crucial respects. The cheap wig had proven inadequate for outdoor wear in wet conditions, leaving behind unmistakable traces of artificial dye. The hasty removal of the disguise had resulted in synthetic fibers being scattered about the crime scene, while the theatrical adhesives had left their own distinctive chemical signatures. Most significantly, the killer had underestimated the observational skills of the village's residents and the methodical investigation that such a crime would inevitably attract. Young Tibby's eyewitness account had provided crucial timing information, while the various physical traces had created an evidentiary trail that led inexorably to the truth. "The question that remains," Miss Marple concluded as she prepared to leave Gossington Hall, "is the identity of the person who possessed both the theatrical skills necessary to execute such a deception and the compelling motive to eliminate Mr. Quint permanently." Lady Bantry, whose own deductive abilities had been sharpened through years of association with Miss Marple, ventured a cautious hypothesis. Someone connected with the Dramatic Society, perhaps? The evidence certainly points toward a person with considerable experience in stage, makeup, and costume. Miss Marple's smile carried the sort of satisfaction that comes with the successful completion of a complex intellectual exercise. "Indeed, Dolly. Someone who had access to theatrical supplies, knowledge of their proper application, and the sort of desperate circumstances that would drive them to attempt such an elaborate solution to their difficulties. The revelation that Mrs. Vale's henna-treated hair could not have produced the fugitive red traces found elsewhere had eliminated the most obvious suspect from consideration. This development transformed the case from a simple matter of domestic violence into a complex puzzle involving theatrical deception and carefully planned murder. As evening approached and Miss Marple made her way home through the familiar streets of St. Mary Mead, she found herself confident that the solution to Mr. Quint's death was now within reach. The various types of red coloring had indeed told their individual stories, and together they painted a picture of premeditated murder, disguised as domestic accident through the clever application of theatrical artifice. Chapter 10. Parlor, Henna, Wig, and Who Wore the Scarlet. The final gathering in Holly Cottage's parlor took place on a gray Saturday morning, with Inspector Slack presiding over what he had reluctantly agreed might be termed a reconstruction of the crime. Miss Marple's gentle but persistent suggestions had eventually overcome his initial resistance to what he privately considered amateur interference, though her previous successes in similar matters had earned her a grudging respect. The assembled company included all the principal figures in the tragic drama that had unfolded the previous Wednesday evening. Mrs. Rosamond Vale sat quietly in her customary chair, her henna-treated hair gleaming dully in the morning light, while Victor Vale fidgeted nervously near the window, his thin hands constantly adjusting his collar and cuffs. Miss Daphne Harrow occupied a position near the hearth, her theatrical instincts apparently compelling her to choose the most dramatically appropriate location in the room. Lady Bantry had accompanied Miss Marple in her unofficial capacity as moral support and witness to the proceedings, while Dr. Haydock represented the medical aspects of the case. The presence of these respected members of the community lent an air of solemnity to the occasion that even Inspector Slack could not entirely dismiss. Miss Marple began her exposition with the sort of methodical precision that had characterized her investigation from its inception. Her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had spent considerable time assembling a complex puzzle and was now prepared to reveal the complete picture that had emerged. "The key to understanding Mr. Quint's death," she announced to the assembled company, "lies in distinguishing between appearance and reality, particularly with regard to the various red-headed women who figured in this case." She proceeded to explain her discoveries about the nature of henna coloring and its behavior under various conditions, using Mrs. Vale's hair as a practical demonstration of the stability that properly applied natural dyes could achieve. The widow submitted to this examination with resigned dignity, though her discomfort with the proceedings was evident in her rigid posture and carefully controlled expression. Mrs. Vale's red eyes, which so captured the villagers' attention, resulted from the irritating effects of fresh henna preparation, Miss Marple continued. "The lemony scent that I detected in this cottage came from the citric acid used to enhance the coloring process, while the orange tide line on the bathroom towel testified to the thorough rinsing that proper henna application requires." Inspector Slack, who had initially approached these proceedings with considerable skepticism, found himself drawn into Miss Marple's methodical reconstruction, despite his professional reservations. The physical evidence she presented was both compelling and comprehensive, creating a picture that differed substantially from his original assessment of the case. Miss Marple's attention then turned to the theatrical elements that had figured so prominently in her investigation. The synthetic fibers, the spirit gum, the wig pin, and the rouge traces all spoke of someone with considerable experience in stage makeup and costume, combined with access to the materials necessary for such elaborate deception. The killer arrived at this cottage on Wednesday evening wearing a cheap theatrical Wig secured with professional-grade adhesive, she explained, indicating the locations where various pieces of evidence had been discovered. The scarlet coloring was of the fugitive variety that runs readily in wet conditions, which explains the staining that was left upon the gate, and the bright red hairs that were found scattered about the gravel. Miss Harrow's face had grown increasingly pale during this exposition, though she maintained her position near the hearth with what appeared to be studied composure. Her theatrical training served her well in concealing her emotional state, though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the subtle signs of mounting tension. This reconstruction of the crime itself was conducted with careful attention to the physical evidence and the timing that various witnesses had established. Miss Marple explained how the killer had used Mrs. Crisp's cloakroom as a changing facility, transforming themselves into a red-headed woman before proceeding to Holly Cottage for the fatal encounter. The quarrel with Mr. Quint took place here in this parlor, Miss Marple continued, indicating the area before the fireplace. When he turned away, perhaps in dismissal or contempt, the killer seized the brass fire screen and struck him down with a deliberate blow that was designed to ensure his permanent silence. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The careful staging of the scene, the attempts to make the death appear accidental, and the elaborate disguise all spoke of planning that extended well beyond the sort of spontaneous violence that Inspector Slack had originally suspected. Most significantly, the timing of the various alibis and the fraudulent signatures that had been discovered painted a picture of someone who had attempted to establish their presence elsewhere through deliberate deception. The handwriting evidence was particularly damning, as it demonstrated the killer's attempt to create documentary proof of innocence. Miss Marple's final revelation came with a sort of quiet certainty that had characterized her approach throughout the investigation. The person who committed this crime possessed the theatrical skills, the desperate motive, and the opportunity necessary to carry out such an elaborate deception. Miss Harrow, I believe you have something to tell us. The silence that followed this accusation stretched for several moments, during which the various members of the assembled company turned their attention to the young actress. Miss Harrow's composure, which had served her well throughout the proceedings, finally began to crack under the weight of the accumulated evidence. Her confession, when it came, was delivered with the sort of dramatic flair that had characterized her amateur theatrical performances. She spoke of Mr. Quint's relentless demands, the impossibility of meeting his financial requirements, and the growing certainty that exposure would destroy her hopes for a legitimate stage career. He laughed, she said finally, her voice breaking with genuine emotion for the first time. About the wig, about my performances, about everything I cared about. He always laughed, and I simply couldn't bear it any longer. Inspector Slack, whose duty now required him to proceed with the formal arrest, did so with a sort of grim satisfaction that came with the successful resolution of a complex case. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession was complete, and justice would be served through the proper channels. As the official proceedings drew to their conclusion, and Miss Harrow was led away to face the consequences of her actions, Lady Bantry turned to Miss Marple with the sort of admiration that her friend's detective work invariably inspired. "Scarlet, so unfair," she murmured, thinking of the way the village gossip had focused upon Mrs. Vale's striking appearance rather than the true nature of the crime. Miss Marple folded her knitting with the sort of quiet satisfaction that came with another mystery successfully resolved. "Color is very useful, my dear, provided one knows whether it runs, whether it melts, and whether it comes by nature or theater." The case of the Scarlet Widow had finally reached its conclusion, revealing that the truth lay not in the obvious explanations that satisfied conventional wisdom, but in the careful observation of details that others had overlooked or dismissed.